Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Announcement. This is a no laptop open situation. Please fold away your laptops now and put them in a storage compartment. Thank you very much. I have Henry's blessing with this announcement. So, today, thank you all for being here, and I am delighted to welcome Professor Lydia Kallipoliti to FIU today. Lydia is Associate Professor at Columbia University in the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning, where she is Director of the MS in Advanced Architecture Design. Lydia is an architect, engineer, and a scholar whose research focuses on the intersections of architecture, technology, and environmental politics. Lydia's work finds in histories of containment and environmental control blueprints for moving into the future. Her scholarship often revisits the 1960s, rereading Rayner Banham, Marshall McLuhan, Buckminster Fuller, and countless others. At the moment when NASA and modernist architecture alike accomplished, so to speak, environmental control. That is, in life support system tests for space, as well as in glass box skyscrapers, the outside was kept out, and nature became something that could be simulated inside a fully engineered interior. In 2018, her book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, cataloged the attempts throughout the 20th century to contain and constrain life processes in such enclosed, regenerative engineered environments. Anchored in the 1960s as the moment at which closed worlds became thinkable through the first images of a whole Earth transmitted from the Apollo missions, this book shows both earlier and later continued attempts to enclose life in an autonomous bubble. Importantly, it underscores that something always leaks when dealing with the complexities of life and the dirty physiology of the body. Building on efforts like Michelle Murphy's book about sick building syndrome, she reveals that recent nomenclatures like sustainable, zero waste, net zero, or these other promises of closed ecological systems today remain fantasy. COVID came just 2 years after the publication of Lydia's book, exploding the conversation about environmental control. Being together with others was relegated to being outside, and we gradually rediscovered the outdoors as no amount of air filtration could save us from ourselves indoors. Germs spread rapidly across the globe, underscoring the world as a global system of flows rather than discrete objects. Lydia's earlier work sits easily as part of recent discussions on the multiple agencies and capacities of environmental forces. For example, air carrying toxic particles, becoming structural when enveloped in plastic, or shaping our reception of media across airwaves. And this is how I encountered her work, as most of you know, initially through my research on air. However, Lydia's exploration extends to the entirety of systems of earthly phenomena as metabolic systems necessary for life on Earth. In her 2024 book, Histories of Ecological Design, she has continued to ask how the laws of nature and ecology can re-encode design principles or tools to inform the very logic of how we design cities and buildings. In other words, nature is not something to aspire to, but a system whose operative logics can be decoded, re-encoded, and integrated into synthetic processes. Her work has been awarded, published, and exhibited widely, including at the Venice Biennial, the Istanbul Design Biennial, the Shenzhen Biennial, the Oslo Architecture Triennale, and so on and so forth. She is the principal of Anna Cycle Research Think Tank and was the head co-curator with Areti Marcopolo of the 2022 Tallinn Architecture Biennial. This effort grew to become the book that she will present today, from Building Metabolism, published this year. In the exhibit and the book, Lydia envisions architecture as a generative, metabolic, digestive system. Can architecture operate less as an object and more as a process that mitigates our contaminating and extracting nature while supporting human and non-human life forms? Can it, she seems to ask, make environment, not only live better in it? Lydia holds a diploma in architecture and engineering from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece, a Master of Science from MIT, and a PhD from Princeton University. Thank you, Lydia, for being here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Kallipoliti.
I really am moved by the introduction, Kate. Thank you. No, it's so profound, and the way that you have described what I do. Maybe it's better than how I will describe it. Let's see. But thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here and be part of your rains and hurricanes and everything you have to do to move around. It's beautiful weather, so thank you to the FIU School for the invitation. I will start the talk by showing you a very small part of my recent book, which is called Histories of Ecological Design, an Unfinished Cyclopedia. And I won't describe really the book, but I will just show you one thread to narrate how the home has become an allegory for the world and why I'm going to speak about domesticity today and reimagine the home as Kate explained as a digestive metabolic system, which is in correlation with a recent project. So, in that book that has a lot of different chapters, if we think of the term ecological design, it is fairly recent. It was coined by a book in 1996 by Stuart Cowan and Sim Vanderen, and they argued, like in most cases of what sustainability is defined, that ecology is based on a seamless integration of human activities with natural processes to minimize environmental impact. And when I started looking into the history of ecologies, I made a very different argument, and I saw that many other authors have made a very different argument that maybe there is no such thing as integration. But since World War II and even before that, there has been a growing interest in a form of synthetic naturalism where the laws of nature and metabolism are displaced from the domain of wilderness and transposed to the domain of cities, buildings, and objects. So, in many ways, ecology is not about being integrated in anything that is a given natural world, but it could also be about the reproduction of natural systems in design principles, mostly by using tools of technological mediation. So, in that book, there are three eras, and I'm not going to explain all of it, but there are three main eras because it started from an encyclopedia for Oxford um, uh, of environmental science. And there's a stage of naturalism, synthetic naturalism, and dark naturalism, which is the period that we are undergoing through now. And this long and varied history is described in the plural form because there are many narratives and worldviews, and the book cannot just be read chronologically, but through a matrix of open associations and threads that are linked in nonlinear ways. So each one of these lines is a way to read a story of ecology as a narrative. And today I'm just going to show you, as a kind of preview to the project of the metabolic home, the project of the household. And the household is important because the word ecology etymologically contains the word ecos, which means house. So, another important critique of that project overall is that in many ways, ecological histories are culturally constructed. They're not found, but they are made. They reflect the ways in which different authors understand the world and how we can create, as designers and thinkers, hierarchical modalities of domination, how we can shape knowledge, control it, and create, kind of shape the physical and material world into ontological and scientific worldviews. And architects have been complicit in this idea that we are constructing different pieces of nature and that we are also designing the planet itself, not just objects on the planet. So it is critical to acknowledge that the history of ecological design is in many ways a deeply rooted and extractive colonial project. And as Andrea Branzi argued in the 1970s, nature is not a physical entity necessarily that is a neutral and free structure that is found, but a great and general product that must be wrapped up to create an ideology and a perfect image of itself. So, in that book, it was also important for each narrative to construct these drawings that are composed of fragments of archival images. And in my work, in addition to writing or doing research historically, I also like to redraw, kind of dismantle a drawing, an archival object that is found as a historical artifact, and reassemble it into um, another form of visualization. And this was a small exhibition that came out of this book that was presented at the Cooper Union in New York in the spring of 2023. Now, going into one particular thread, which is going to make my introduction about the house, we're going to look at three different chapters in three different centuries, basically. And we're going to start from the project of home economy in the 18th and 19th century, going to the idea of energy autonomy and the logic of more than human life, which I will eventually jump to the current project. So, starting by that, you see the word here, "ikos." It's actually, a lot of people pronounce it oikos, but I'm from Greece and I know that it is "ikos," so keep that in mind. It's a very important piece of information that I always like to share. But it contains the house. The house becomes the space um, that basically defines what is the relationship of a kind of living entity with nature. And it was coined in 1866 by Ernst Haeckel. And 26 years after Haeckel coined that term, the woman that's on the screen, whose name was Ellen Swallow Richards, and she was the first woman that graduated from MIT in chemistry in 1900. You see her here among all of these men. She she contacted Haeckel to ask for permission. She was a chemist, and she wanted permission to use the word ecology with an amended meaning. Haeckel used it metaphorically, house as a metaphor, to denote nature's household, a concept that originates from a German word, Naturhaushalt. His focus did not fall on the house as a domestic environment, literally, but on the relationships between animals and the inorganic and organic environments of different organisms. Swallow Richards, on the other hand, wanted to use the word in a different light, to understand the health of a house as a concept that extends to the health of the world at large. And it was very interesting to me when I found what she was writing. She wrote this that was like cooking and cleaning, and the only thing that was inside the book was chemical equations. And that was in early 1900s. So what she proposed was to replace home economics with ecology as a tool to battle ill health based on the principles of environmental science and home management. Her initiative to promote home economics was also a legitimate branch, as a legitimate branch of environmental science, was also a way to validate higher education for women at that time. In her mind, the cleanup of a home was a way to ameliorate society itself. So, Swallow Richard's hopes for ecology quickly evaporated. And the reason why is because in 1893, the British Medical Journal definitively defined ecology as a form of knowledge that is obtained only from morphology and physiology, chiefly resting on the exploitation of the endless phenomena of animal and plant life as they manifest themselves under natural conditions. That was their quote and their explanation. So, this literary conflict, right, this debate that one person meant ecology as a metaphor and the other literally as a way to create a healthy environment chemically, shows that Haeckel and Swallow Richards cast the word ecos in different lights. For Haeckel, it indicated an outside, a house of nature, and the concept of inhabiting the world that called for documenting, categorizing, and visualizing branches and interrelationships of life, which is akin to the whole journeys of environmental explorers. Most of them were German in the 19th century. For Swallow Richards, on the other hand, the home was an inside. It referred to the life of domestic management linked to the health of its inhabitants. She envisioned ecology as the projection of the interior to the outside world as a form of municipal housekeeping. This dichotomy between inside and outside grew directly from established gender divisions in the 19th century. The ideology of separate spheres, or the dichotomy between the domestic and the public, that John Ruskin, the famous preservationist, declared necessary for the preservation of a balanced society. In fact, in one of his talks, which was in of Queen's Gardens, a lecture that he gave in London in 1864, Ruskin insisted that the role of men was to venture into the public sphere and earn a living, and the role of women was to remain at home and maintain it as a sanctuary and place of peace for men to return. And he believed in this distinct division as an equal allocation of roles that ensures the happiness and perfection to both genders. So, with these types of constraints at the time, a lot of women of the middle and upper classes who were interested in environmental activism, they did not only have to defend their activities as extensions of their roles as wives and mothers, but also to conceptualize their ideas or the environment as beginning from the home and moving outwards. So a lot of women were drawn to home-related issues that fell under the banner of municipal housekeeping, like ensuring safe air, food, and water for the families or conserving nature to beautify their lives. Another important predecessor to Swallow Richards was Catherine Beecher, who, along with her sister Harriet Beecher, wrote a very important book that you see, The American Woman's Home and the Principles of Domestic Science, in 1869, which is really famous in architecture because it was cited by Siegfried Gideon when he wrote The Mechanization Takes Command, and that kind of established modernity in the 20th century, and then by Rainer Banham in The Architecture of Well-Tempered Environment. Beecher imagined the house as an independent, autonomous unit operated without external help. So this was a way to be also an abolitionist, to promote anti-slavery, which is something that her sister, Harriet Beecher, was very famous for. She advocated that if you have the knowledge to run an independent domestic unit, that that serves as the basis of a democratic society because you don't need external help um, in the form of servants, basically. So that would urge women to really be knowledgeable of domestic management, hygiene, proper ventilation, and general health, as well as medical explanations. And then, in that light, she was the first, let's say, designer engineer that Rainer Banham cited. And a lot of the typologies that she invented were extremely important. So she drew the core of mechanical services, which is basically to concentrate all the mechanical services in one core, along with the circulation, which is a kind of very common typology even today that holds today. She argued for very particular ways to arrange items in the kitchen and airflow, pointing, kind of proposing her own air duct models as scientific domestic ventilation. She also pointed to health-related dangers that arise when little or no consideration is given to the problems of heating and ventilation or plumbing and storage. So, making a kind of jump from the 19th century to the 1960s, just like this autonomy was envisioned at that point as being emancipated um, of external help, of service, basically. In the 60s, in correlation to kind of liberation movements, energy autonomy was understood as a tool of political resistance, and because one would be autonomous from the power grid. So a house is always attached to the power grid, and the grid becomes an authority to which one must comply. The autonomous house of the 60s and 70s was popularized as a libertarian and ecological way of living and acting as a means to emancipate from the grid of supplies. So, a lot of these ideas were inspired by Murray Booking's vision for societal transformation initiated by self empowerment, which appeared on the cover of London magazine Anarchy in 1971. This features the growth of new roots, the illustration suggesting that basically, if one generates power and generates matter, people can grow their own living environments and they can create, in a way, metaphorically, their own grid from the point of the house outwards, in a similar concept of growing from the inside outwards that we have discussed. So some of these concepts were underlying recent work that I have done, and this is the Tallinn Architecture Biennial in 2022 that I co-curated with Areti Marcopoulou. And the idea of recirculation of resources and the idea of domesticity was very much present in these works. In that light, in these projects, we were also very interested in understanding in reimagining planetary food systems and their relationship to architecture, because the current global food system is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and it is extremely alienated from the source of provision. It ranges. There are so many issues that we can discuss, which I will not go over with. But as the need for food continues to grow in response to increasing urbanization, the alienation between people and their sources of provision also grows. And speaking of alienation, I'm just going to show you this funny example that was from a paper about 10 years ago. This is a chicken in a span of from 1957 to 2005. And because of the way that poultry is raised to become food, the chicken have quadrupled in size, and they are currently unable to walk. So they're being raised to become sources of food without even becoming living organisms. So they're developed. We are physically altering living beings to support the logistical machines of industrialized agriculture. So, the very general questions that can be raised from the domestic environment to that is, how can we design an architecture that metabolizes, the architecture of metabolism? How can architecture redefine resources, produce food, and be eaten away? Like, eaten away meaning dissolve or become itself food in one way or another. So we try to envision in this kind of venue um, an architecture that may produce resources, digest its waste, and decompose, radically intervening in this light to the extractive, consumptive, and contaminating logic of the built environment. And food is very important because by eating, in many ways, we ingest the planet, and in turn, the planet becomes a depository of our excretions. And this is a very primordial, visceral relationships of interdependency, which is sensed via architecture, which in many ways provides the medium where resource consumption and decomposition, as well as body sheltering or micro-macro climate change, is registered. In this venue, which was 3 years ago, we imagined the exhibition as a form of house, which we labeled the metabolic home, and we were interested to redefine the concept of inhabitation, urging visitors to participate in a curated experiment. There were 7 installations that exhibited how different kinds of metabolic processes were related to food and were linked to everyday domestic spaces and activities. With the metabolic home, we were interested in the house as a microcosm of the world and a test bed of how resources could be recirculated. So the house has been historically, but still is, an allegory to larger and smaller spheres of action. But it is also an intimate space that brings idea of recycling and regeneration to everyday life. It relates to everyone. Everyone lives in a house. So to build the house, we assigned different programs to different architects and requested that each one of the topics would communicate with each other. So they had this prompt, the different architects that we had invited, that the waste of one space must become input for another. So each space was related to a program of domesticity, but also a metabolic activity. So producing food was presented in a vertical robotic garden, processing in an interspecies kitchen, ingesting in a rewilded dining room, digesting in a lounge with an edible outer envelope, hydrating in a toilet that recirculated and filtered water, breaking nutrients in a vertical terrace for harvesting, upcycling in a garage that made carbon negative voxels. And each domestic space was part of a larger domestic ecosystem that interacted with the other house parts in a feedback chain of resource exchanges. One inspiration for us for this was this house that was a kind of drawing of a designer, an American designer from Minnesota, whose name was William Stumpf, who was a very famous industrial designer because he designed the iron chairs and was collaborating with a famous chef called Julia. Yeah, Childs. Sorry, I blanked out on her last name. So he documented her kitchen and he designed this house, and it was really about furniture and ergonomics. But he was really interested in the idea of metabolism, saying things like, since we have a digestive systems, our living spaces should also have a digestive system. Um, so it was not really about imitating natural system, but rather in exploring alternative patterns of energy reuse and consumerism. So this portrayal of a home, and this is one of the works at the Italian Architecture Biennale, the Interspecies Kitchen by Andreas Hake, Office for Political Innovation, and it was important to look at debris, the waste of our own production processes, in a visceral way via the raw ecology of bodies and the understanding that these problems are not outside of the spaces that we occupy. They cannot be relayed to the management of resources in an urban level, but they're landing back on the bodies that inhabit the spaces that we create. And it was also very important, and this is from an earlier project, a kind of drawing, that how what are the new types of programmatic alliances? How can we actually create new types of programs and spaces when we understand how resources can be recirculated? What are the relationships between a kitchen waste and a bathtub, a toilet and a garden, a bioreactor and a bathroom? And these kinds of connections display reasons, modes, and trajectories for existential change. Habitation, through this process, is reconceptualized and transforms spaces where dichotomies and distinctions like inside and outside, body and habitat and environment are always changing. We also looked at early living machines, and these are not necessarily habitation environments, but this is a very famous one, the Ark of Cape Cod, that was built by a group of biologists in the 1970s in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and it was a miniaturized ecosystem for alternative food production hailing from the belief that the Ark could serve as the lifeboat of biological diversity and autonomy, very much like Noah's Ark if the existing agriculture system on Earth would fail. The arks were living communities and material testbeds for the coexistence and interaction of diverse species as experiments for practicing controlled agriculture, aquaculture, and passive and solar heating. And it was, I think Kate mentioned this a little bit, but in my one of my earlier books, I was describing how fragile it is to curate an ecosystem within a domestic space, and how the goal of these types of spaces that involve biotic matter, living organisms is to calibrate ecosystemic balance and maintain a livable interior environment. Um, and to do that, they had a big congregation of marine biologists transferring principles from wetland ecologies to inhabitable microenvironments. And that's where the term living machine was first coined. What was interested theoretically, and they have written many books that they argue about this, is that in many ways, their project was not really about shaping the form or the shell or the envelope of any of these types, but the physical tools that enable the nourishing thermal mass that empower what they called productive associations between species, animals, and microorganisms. Architecture was understood by that group as the fusion of boundaries between organic and inorganic element, the calibration and construction of a composite living world where, for example, bacteria could feed from a boundary. This conceptual model for architecture, which was opposed to Le Corbusier's metaphor of machines for living, which is something very different than living machines, was announced as a performative environment with corporeal and measurable input and output. It was the group intention to outline what they called a living form, one that would create spatial form and morphic order simultaneously. So, in the words that they used, in defiance of entropy, energy could be harnessed to work on the side of life or to design life anew. So, with these kind of thoughts in mind, um, we, we curated as part of this event, which leads to the next installation that I will show you, a performance, which was how to inhabit this house and what are the actions that are needed, you know, that need to take place in order for it to work, in order to feed the thermal mass. It is not a type of passive engagement, but it requires participation. So these, they were actors actually, because in a museum environment it was not allowed to inhabit a house literally. But this was a kind of challenging task of um, going from one space to the other and transferring different kinds of materials for nourishment, for waste, keeping things alive. It required um, full participation. But also, you see that a lot of the installations, and this was designed, the dining table was designed by Haley Eber and Mei Ling Loco. Um, they designed also tools for eating, the one that you see. So instead of having knives and forks and utensils, the way that we understand how to use normative tools, they have created their own tools, and everything was there on the table 24 hours to create a kind of edible landscape that can be harnessed throughout different periods. Okay, so following that, which was in 2022, trying to, okay. Following that stage, um, we created a new version of the metabolic house, um, at the Venice Architecture Biennial. It's currently on display until the end of November, and it is a very big installation. It's about, you'll see a video, but it's about 5 meters to 5 meters. It is in scale 1 to 1 in a kind of residential building. And we took a kind of crop of a kind of normal residential building, any kind of built environment, and within that we assigned different functions to each one of the rooms and curated the different kinds of interrelationships of input and output to redesign the spaces and the way that they would kind of communicate with each other. And on the left, you see a view where you see some of these spaces, the bedroom, the kitchen, and further back, the laboratory, and this is the toilet. And these tubes that you see are all the different kinds of metabolic flows, and which not only become a piping system, but they're indications of flows of matter and energy that actually become and reshape the way that spaces look like. This is the balcony on the left that becomes a space for trans-species cohabitation and the garden. It's important also to say that each one of these spaces was researched quite thoroughly. Unfortunately, the screen doesn't have really good um, resolution, so you're missing some shading that I can have here. But um, we did a lot of numbers. I have an engineering background, and with my partner, we really crunched out the numbers to make sure that the sizes, the conversions, the machines are all using existing specs. And we're not designing a utopia. It is not a fantastical scheme, but it's basically a scheme that uses existing infrastructure and understands the kind of basic physiology of the body and the way that input can become output. So every space, this is the kitchen, and of course in the kitchen we do things like um, we collect organic waste and we compost it, we take it to the garden, we create biofuel by collecting fat, and we're converting fat into biofuel with these machines, the black ones there. Um, the kitchen is made out of biochar, which is a kind of material that is being constructed in the laboratory, in the storage space. So this house becomes a space um, that builds itself, like it's constantly in construction. So we have to understand, in light of this project, as architecture as a vessel for bodies that metabolize. Greenhouse gas concentrations, operational carbon emissions, and other metrics are not just measurements, but they are literally embedded in bodies that, as physical entities as we are, experience the world, sweat, excrete, leak, and shed, and reveal ways in which environments manifest themselves. So bodies are co-produced by and with the environment. They're not passive organisms that are inserted into a space and a built and measured context. So understanding and working with the metabolism of bodies coincides with the idea of cohabiting the world in which subjects of any kind are mediums of ingestions and excretion and become operators of the spaces they inhabit, embracing labor as care. So, in the bedroom, for example, the salt bricks are, well, this kind of strange mattress is being made from the roots of plants, and the kind of salt bricks are being made from a specific kind of crystallization process that takes place from inside the house. Um, so there's a lot of work that's being done in this participation, but it is not the type of burdensome maintenance, but rather a means of apprehending the world um, via bodies being entangled with planetary climates. Here you can see the light well, which in many buildings, and especially Where I come from in Europe, there's always a kind of light shaft, and that's a very damp and narrow space most of the times. It doesn't have much light. And in this space, we can create it's really a very good environment for mycelium growth and for environments that create substrates for other kind of processes. Um, the storage is a space of production where many of these activities, like cooking and sewing and converting matter and weaving, take place. And it really becomes an argument that architecture could itself metabolize the waste products of a human's body digestive system are connected to numerous treatment systems that allow it to be incorporated in a wider ecological continuum. The waste products of buildings don't do that yet. So they all of the waste products are connected with infrastructure that leads to landfills currently. But thinking what it would mean to build systems that are capable of treating the food and the waste of bodies would entail nothing short of radically rethinking what it means to build a city as such. So, in this context, this becomes the design of this house is not just a kind of design manifesto of creating new forms of inhabitation, but it is also um, a question of environmental equity. Because if we don't export waste into territories that are for disenfranchised populations and we keep the waste, the kind of byproducts of living processes, close to the buildings that we occupy, what would a new kind of matrix of habitation look like? What would it be to navigate ideas relative to urban growth and degrowth, alternative food production, decomposition of building materials, transspecies ecologies, and alternative communities? So, overall, in the project, in different ways, and I don't want to go into the logistics of each one, this is a kind of living space that basically these are sacks of peanuts, of certain kinds of elements, the oil of which can become biofuel through a series of processes of filtration to power other systems in the house, like a projection here, for example. But what is important is the exploration of processes of digestion, growth, leakage, excretion, expansion, deflation, movement, self regulation as patterns of energy, material generation, and distribution within a multiverse, or as Arturo Escobar calls it, a pluriverse, a reality that does not separate humans from non humans, but urges the assessment of a shifting web of life and death as alternative forms of matter. Most importantly, I think the argument is that ideas of metabolism can become an antidote or an alternative solution to environmental inequality, which is largely increased by the displacement of unwanted matter outside metropolitan environments. If buildings were designed to retain and digest their waste on site, waste would not travel so far and add to the burden of supply chains, nor would it need to be deposited on the cheap land of disenfranchised populations. Therefore, built environments with the potential to produce matter, grow edible matter, and possibly serve as food themselves are analyzed in larger geopolitical contexts as from extraction to demolition, as a perceptual shift in exploring the world as a continuum of lively bodies and forces. And I will show you just a small video that explains a little bit the project, which is currently on display. So of this work has also just been published as a book, an edited book, in collaboration again with Areti Marcopoulou, um, which is just released. And the program of the book was also structured through the concept of the house as a stage set for domestic occupation. So in the book, there's the planetary home and the metabolic home, and it becomes a kind of structure for different living experiments, the home and the planet, in which humans and other species, as well as the resources of space and territory, become interlinked and integral components of habitation. So the metabolic home, as we have seen, becomes a digestive system that receives output and waste in multiple forms. And the content of the book go by room, and in each room, there's a project narrative and an actionable prototype, essays and cookbooks as design propositions. And the planetary home, which is the second part of the book, highlights the interdependencies of food systems, culture, political economy, and geography, from local material banks to cultural practices rooted in the land and food and justice, driven by ecological transformation. The planetary home engages large scale territories as mass migration, food sourcing, and challenging environmental conditions and zones of conflict. So, thinking of the planet as a home urges us to rethink our relationship with the earth and advocate for different kinds of relationships that, as Donna Haraway writes, calls them symphonic forces. And along these lines, she says, I'm a compostist, not a post humanist. We are all compost, not post human. So the planetary home is not an abstract entity like, let's say, the cloud that we're discussing so many times in architecture conversations that must be regulated and managed, but it is a concoction of abject matter and political and social structures that reside and nurture territories. It is a reminder that we're still situated in the world and we have a material presence as living bodies. It's also important to share that in the book, like the projects that are being featured are published as cookbooks and manuals in a very particular way as recipes, because it was a very interesting exercise and assignment to present architecture as a kind of culinary discipline through a series of steps that one can either follow or not follow and deviate from. And it was a very interesting kind of exercise for all the people that have presented their work to think of what are the ingredients of a work, what are the steps um, through which one can come to a solution to reorganize and reinvent. But also, the cookbook is in itself reorganized and reinvented by the reader as a kind of metabolic design action, a code that can either be heated, followed, or reshaped and hacked. The discoveries made through the design of cookbooks have generative potential, which is achievable by observing and deviating from the rules. So, this type of writing is not a neutral way of recording a process, but it also um, creates a story, it designs a story and transforms that story. So the cookbook itself becomes an instrument for designing metabolism. So this is what I had to share. This is a small video of the project. I don't know if I should leave it or not. It's just for the closing of the Biennale. This is Areti and me at in Venice, where we share some of these thoughts. But you can also see it at home and we can discuss it. Or if you want to see it, I'll play it, whatever you want. Thank you.
I have about a million, so I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Lydia. That was incredible. Anybody burning with a question, or should I jump in? Okay. I think for me, what this metabolic home brings up is the question of the architect, right? And architecture as process. And we were talking this morning about how the major shifts in the 1960s involved a lot of protests of Beaux-Arts education and the models that needed to change to kind of update to the modernizing, postmodern then world. And I wonder, as in your role as pedagogue, what are our biggest gaps in knowledge to grapple with ideas like metabolism in architecture? What knowledge do we need to obtain or collaborate to be able to think and imagine in this way as in a more common way than we currently do?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and it's a very general one as well. But one of the things that we do, and a lot of students when they come in the MSAD program, which is the one that I'm directing at Columbia, we're discussing the question of unlearning, right? Like what is it that we do as architects, and how can we unlearn certain concepts of what we think we do so that we can start engaging with different ways of approaching phenomena and using questions like what the new alchemists were doing, for example, to understand the nourishing of a thermal mass as a type of design activity. So for me, that's the most rewarding part, the unlearning part, where students that come from all over the world, and sometimes they come from professional architecture degrees, and they say that we have been trained to become professional building designers, to be very proficient and capable with constructing environments, designing details. But the questions that we're raising here in this program are questioning what it means to be an architect. So I think this is not a question that I can answer for everyone, because everyone has a different answer. But definitely, I think that we live in a time that we have an expanded role in the world, in how we shape the world. And that does not just entail the design of building form. And in order to understand how anything that we do can be of impact relative to climate change, to questions of equity and justice, we have to understand the world in many different layers, and one of these layers is metabolism. This is just my insight, right? Like the way that I have been working in the last few years, since 2022, I guess, on this project. Before I was working on closed roles, but there are other ways to do that. And at Columbia, we have like groups focusing on civic actions, for example, or environmental justice. So understanding materiality and territorial materiality, where do things come from and where do things go, which is kind of an oversimplification of what I was talking about, is one way to understand the expanded role of an architect. But for a lot of people, It also becomes a work of activism, social justice. For others, it becomes a technical expertise of understanding data retrieval. So I think that there's like 1,000 different ways to be an architect today. And certainly this is something that we have come to terms with. We have students that become, I don't know, like from documentary film producers to um, space engineers um, to working for tech companies and kind of leading community groups. So um, I think I think we're very privileged that we're able to think through so many different domains of knowledge and question what we can do and what the kind of the cross-disciplinary engagement, how can we use that to impact larger problems rather than just designing, let's say, the space that we occupy.
As you were talking, I kept thinking about the larger scale, the scale of a town, scale of a city, and the scale also of sort of food generation in relationship to the scale of habitation and so forth. And so, I think this is a sort of wonderful way to shift our thinking from the object to the system, from the object to what it does or what role it plays. So I was wondering if you were thinking, I mean, I think at a certain level it's obvious it's sort of a metaphor for larger systems, and that you're using it almost poetically.
Well, thank you. And I think you really pinpointed something very important that I read when I was a student like you, and I was writing my thesis. I was at MIT, and a very important artist that was a visual art professor, Georgi Kepes, that was a student of Moholy Nagy, and at MIT he was very famous. I was reading one of his books, and he said something that was kept in my brain since forever. He said, the most fundamental reorientation of the 20th century was the move from objects to systems, to flows, basically. That in the 19th century, objects were traded through kind of, let's say, Marx's logistics of reification, and it was really about kind of validating the idea of how to construct and how to trade an object. And then in the 20th century, he was saying that in the 1970s, the world was understood through flows, through the ways. That was also, I think that can relate to your work, Kate. It was after we saw the Earth, after we understood that different energy flows in the Earth flow. So it was a very important part of the agenda to understand environmental systems as different resources that flow and can be connected. So this is what he said, and in the book that I was showing at the beginning, the first period is the period of objects, the second of systems, and the third is of clouds. Our period, clouds, as we live through the world, not through systems of hierarchy that are linked, but through aggregations of things that become data coalitions and are connected through fractional correlations. So this is a very important transition, which I think all of the 60s and 70s work showed. Right now, we are doing that in the metabolic home, but we're also trying to transition to what a cloud might mean, not a system of space A and C and D being connected through certain lines in a web, which is the way that the world was understood when information would connect different dots. But now we are occupying a different, I think, epistemological framework. And it's important also to think what that might mean in terms of the production of space in the metabolic cone. But I don't have a definitive answer to that. So thank you.
I can speak as well. Oh.
So hello there. Thank you for your presentation. It's a lot to digest, a lot of information. And
It's about digestion.
digestion, no pun intended. But my kind of question for you is, maybe I didn't catch it, but what is kind of like your end goal? Is it more to make like a statement, or is it more to like maybe produce this in, like in such a way where you can actually like master plan it? Like, what is the end goal for the, what's it called, the house?
The end goal. Well, to be honest, I don't know if there's an end goal. I think that we have. I'm not building, right? Like I'm doing these projects, but I am an engineer, so I understand how things work. And I think the end goal is, I would say, to build this, but not as because I want to see it built. I think that a lot of work in academia is like, oh, I have to build this. For me, that's not the end goal. It is really to change the way that the role of infrastructure, I would say, in architecture, which I think is very much related to the way that environmental inequality is shaped in territories. I'm really interested in machines, the alliances of different kind of infrastructural systems, and how they can reshape territories. And I start to think like from smaller scales. But all of what I said can sound very fantastical and utopic very quickly if you don't know exactly the different stages to do that. And I think that it's not just about materializing a different kind of system. It really is about questioning why are we here? Why do we have behind this is different stories of research, right? Like I discovered I was chasing a train from New York City that transferred all the poo shit, basically that was from my previous book, that it was taking it to Alabama because the land was cheap and the people there were poor, and that's where all the shit was deposited. And there's similar situations like this that contribute to environmental inequality, and they all have to do with import and export. And if we as architects can potentially, right, that's just a thought, intervene in the way that we process some of these things and reshape our environments to do this, then we would kind of contribute to eliminating some of these inequalities. So that's where I come from, and that's what motivates me. But I'm not as naive as to think that a team of me, my partner, and the people that are working with us can eliminate environmental inequality, right? Like it's not something feasible. But we can think of other ways, and maybe by building on them and by understanding the technology, by the time that we die, maybe there will be a system like that, and maybe 100 years from now, there will be some change.
Thank you.
Hi. Over here. Thank you. I really appreciated your presentation, and from my understanding and kind of backpacking onto what the guy before me was saying, that I kind of understood this project to be large scale, and they would have to start kind of transforming a city as a whole. And I was wondering if you have any intention or idea to reverse engineer that and kind of create a kit of parts that people could integrate into their already existing homes, and how that could kind of work. Like if you live with processes kind of similar to these in your home already, or how we can kind of
Oh,
start in a smaller
definitely.
form.
Definitely. I mean, we're in the process right now of talking to different kind of companies and to develop some of these ideas. But there are systems like that. This is not new, what I presented. I mean, this is just like one version out of so many energy autonomous houses that have been built as experiments, and especially since the 60s and 70s. So no way am I promoting this as a kind of new concept. There are Clivus toilets, composting systems, recirculation systems, and a lot of the things that I have shown are using existing systems because we researched, we have a database of these systems. So, and sometimes, like, we take the way that an existing system that has very particular shape works and we put it as part of a context. What doesn't really exist is putting them together. That's why we did this project. So there are pieces, parts and pieces, and there are a lot of environmental cuckoos that I interviewed for my PhD that like have developed these systems, like people that have used, I don't know, like poop for methane and digesters, and so there's a lot of research on that. But what is less out there is the kind of know-how to put them together in a way that changes the way that we occupy the spaces. So a lot of times, like the architects, the experimental architects, like in one of my previous book that Kate mentioned, like I interviewed, which was called The Architecture of Closed Worlds. I interviewed about 10 people that did these kinds of houses in the 60s and 70s, and they did them as experiments, and they build them, and they have stories about like what worked and what didn't. But in most cases, they were extremely, what's the right word? Not unrefined, but they were like putting the stuff together without like designing the context in which they all coexist and reshape the way that we occupy spaces, right? And that's what we can do as architects, right? Like we don't only take the existing Clivus toilet and the existing composting bin, but what we can do is understand the operation of what it might do and design a system that will take some of these components in a new light, and the off heat of one process could become a heated environment in another, let's say. So that's what, I know that that sounds difficult to grasp right now, but they were not designed very well, or they didn't really, I mean, one of the motivations was to see what is the role of us as designers in understanding and reshaping these kinds of processes. And that is one goal. But it's definitely, this metabolism is a new word. I mean, metabolism is not even a new word. Like there were the Japanese metabolists in the 60s that's what in architectural history metabolism refers to. But it's a word that speaks of a project that's quite old historically. It has a legacy. And how we can see it in new light is the challenge. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think I can be. Thank you. So I have a question. Thanks, you brought in the book, What is the Power of Shit? The Architecture of the Closed World. So one way to look at metabolisms in your book is also through these closed systems and systems that are meant to succeed at the end, or branches of the system that are meant to succeed. Uh, I wonder if systems should be thought of to even think of from the point of view of built to decompose, failure, built to kind of stop in the system's chain at certain point and the other system takes over. So I'm trying to understand the work through the lens of, or I'm trying to understand the alternative lens of looking at these ideas of metabolism as a system of closed loops. So I wonder if this is something that you've kind of also explored through your teaching or in the books that coming up.
Yes, thank you. That's a really excellent question. I One of the things that I discovered in that book, as you say, and I think Kate also mentioned this, is that most net zero spaces that recirculate resources are not possible, like, or they don't really work. And in that first book, I had actually a chapter on how each failed. In what ways did each one of these experiments fail? Either it failed because there was a technical problem, or it failed because the people that were organizing it fought between them and there was a social problem, or it failed because nobody was interested in it, or there were different formats of failure, right, or understanding failure. But this is why the idea of a circle, of like a full cycle, is an impossibility, right? And this is something that we argue for in the book, and I argued for it in Closed Worlds. But metabolism is not about a cycle. It is about a process, right? Like a process that doesn't need to complete autonomy. So it is about transference from one thing to the other, with no indication of whether this transference should close cycles. And I think that's the difference, and that's what was important to understand in this project. So a lot of times when we say net zero, like, and we have also policies that reflect net zero. Like in New York, we have like 2050 that New York will be net zero. It won't be. But it becomes an aspiration to move towards something, right? But it's important to also understand that even if the cycle is an impossibility, it can become the idea of metabolism, of creating resources, of regenerating resources, is important because it becomes a microgrid within the grid. Like it generates more than it loses. So instead of being consumptive, an object can also generate something. And within that balance, there is a logistics of transference, which creates different kinds of connections, both socially and politically. Time for one more.
Yeah, it's the one more.
Thanks so much.
So much for this beautiful lecture. I really enjoyed fascinating drawings and layouts, and model is just amazing. My question is about the connection of this individual unit or group of units to the environment itself. It captured my attention that the model is on pylons and the things are hanging from sky. I'm a landscape architect and an architect and an engineer, and I'm just trying to see how you are envisioning to situate these things to environment. How it seemed like things are coming indoors, so plants coming indoors becoming bed, mushrooms coming indoors becoming food. Even the garden is interior. So I was wondering
how this ecological system of hub actually connects the real ecology that's outdoors. So looking forward to your answer. Thank you.
No, that's an amazing question. And to be honest with you, I don't have an answer. But what I do know is that the crop that you see, the house, right? Like what did I show? Um, this thing, right? It is a crop of the city, right? And it was one of the things that we took as like a default mechanism, that we're only working with an existing environment that is decaying and requests rehabilitation, because this is a chunk of something that exists everywhere, right? Like everywhere in the world, there are dense urban environments that people live in boxes, and they request. And in a way, we reinvented a landscape inside this framework instead of connecting to the larger existing ecosystem, as you say. So we did not answer the question that you're asking. And I'm just being very honest here, like we recreated the ecosystem within that environment rather than kind of having an umbilical cord with the existing ecosystem. And whether, and I think that that kind of hesitation was also intentional in some ways, because I don't necessarily believe, or I'm in sync with the idea that we're all part of this continuum in nature, and that we are, are to be connected with nature, because I'm not sure it exists in the way that it has been idealized in the past, that nature is this idealized setting that we're all kind of synced with. And a lot of the work, a lot of my work, like theoretically when I'm writing, I'm kind of questioning that nature is a construct, right? It is a way to understand how we are recreating environments. That doesn't mean that if I were to think like, how are the mushrooms coming? Are they growing in there? Are they growing in the ground? Like, I feel like that is the next assignment. I really feel that this is an assignment that will lead into, okay, you've done the house, then how does that connect or not connect with a larger framework of forces? And what are the kind of protocols of engagement? But I'm hesitating to go both ways. But thank you for your question, and I'll keep it in my heart for the future.
Landscape architects looking forward to collaborate.
Lydia, thank you so much for your beautiful lecture. Thank
Thank
you
you
all
for
for your
having me.
wonderful questions.